We'll continue our review of gross anatomy now with a discussion of the upper limb. Now, the topics that are important for us to discuss with regard to preparation for the USMLE for the upper limb are primarily the neuromuscular components of the upper limb. Most of the questions that we would see with regard to the upper limb are going to be nerve injury questions, with either nerves that are injured and questions about functional losses associated with those injuries, or functional losses and questions about what nerve injury or how did that nerve injury occur. So we need to know about the neuromuscular components. We need to discuss nerve injuries. Of lesser importance, so we'll spend very brief time on it, is the arterial supply, and then we'll talk about a couple of areas of skeletal injuries in the region of the shoulder and the region of the wrist. So let's start by taking a look at the nerve supply to the upper limb. And that nerve supply is the brachial plexus, schematized on this drawing here. So what we see is that the brachial plexus is formed by 5 what are called roots, coming from C5 to T1. Now, be aware of the fact that even though they're called the roots of the brachial plexus, what they actually are the anterior rami of the spinal nerves. Remember that posterior rami don't go to the limbs, only anterior rami do. So these are the C5, 6, 7, 8, and T1 anterior rami just after they have emerged from the intervertebral foramen. Then what happens is that the C5 and C6 ramus comes together, bundled together by connective tissue into a structure called the upper trunk or superior trunk. The same thing happens with C8 and T1 rami. They get bundled together by connective tissue into what's called the lower or inferior trunk. And then C7 stays by itself, changes its name to the middle trunk. So from the 5 roots, we now end up with 3 trunks, upper, middle, and lower. We're still in the neck. This is still happening in the neck. As we are exiting from the neck to begin to enter the axilla, to enter the upper limb, each one of the 3 trunks divides into two what are called divisions. One is an anterior division and the other is a posterior division. So that's anterior and posterior, anterior, posterior, anterior, and posterior. Now, to appreciate why this is happening, why these trunks are dividing into divisions, we need to think about how the limb develops. In the initial development of the limb bud, as the mesoderm that's in the limb bud arranges itself, we start off with a central core of mesoderm, dense core of mesoderm, which becomes the skeleton of the limb, and the remainder of the mesoderm mostly becomes the muscles of the limb, which means that those cells that are going to become muscles in the upper limb are either going to be in front of that bony core or behind the bony core. So the cells that are going to become the muscles of the limb right from the beginning are organized into 2 groups, an anterior compartment and a posterior compartment. And we'll see later on that the anterior compartments of muscles will become flexor muscles mostly, and the posterior compartment will become extensor muscles. But with regard to nerve supply, what that means is that as the motor nerves that have to innervate these developing muscles grow out into the limb, they either have to go into the anterior part of the limb to innervate the anterior developing muscles, or into the posterior part of the limb to innervate the posterior developing muscles. And so we still, in the adult, see a reflection of that bifurcation of pathways, with the anteriorly migrating fibers being in the anterior compartment, and the posterior migrating fibers being in the posterior division. Anterior and posterior divisions going to anterior and posterior compartments. So that's going to be true for each of the 3. What that tells us is that any motor fiber that's in any of the 3 anterior divisions will be a motor fiber innervating an anterior compartment muscle, and any motor fiber in any of the 3 posterior divisions will be a motor fiber that will innervate a posterior compartment muscle. Then, as we proceed out into the axilla, what we see is that the anterior division of the upper and middle trunk get bundled together into what's called the lateral cord. The anterior division of the lower trunk stays by itself and changes its name to medial cord, and the posterior divisions of all three trunks get bundled together and gets to be called the posterior cord. So as we pass through the axilla, we have a lateral, a medial, and a posterior cord. Those three names, lateral, medial, and posterior, are given to those cords based on the position of the cord relative to the artery that's running right down the center of the axilla, called the axillary artery. So the lateral cord is lateral to the artery, medial cord is medial to the artery, and of course the posterior cord is posterior to the artery. But importantly, in terms of innervation, take note that the lateral cord is made up of only anterior division fibers and the medial cord is made up of only anterior division fibers, and the posterior cord is made up of entirely posterior division fibers. So as we've gone from three trunks in the neck to three cords in the axilla, we've rearranged the fibers and segregated the anterior fibers into two of the cords and the posterior fibers into the third cord. Then each of the three cords divides into two. The lateral cord divides into two. One branch is called the musculocutaneous nerve, and one branch will contribute to the median nerve. The medial cord divides into two. One branch is the ulnar nerve, and one branch is the other contribution to the median nerve. And then the posterior cord divides into two. One branch is the axillary nerve, one branch is the radial nerve. So we end up with five what are called terminal nerves: musculocutaneous, median, and ulnar, which are anterior division nerves. That means they contain only anterior division fibers, which means that the motor fibers in those nerves will innervate anterior compartment muscles. And the other two nerves, axillary and radial, are made up of only posterior division nerves, meaning they will go to posterior compartment muscles. So those are the five nerves that are going to innervate most of the upper limb: the arm, the forearm, and the hand. Now we see that before we have gotten to the point where those five nerves are developed, we see that a whole bunch of other branches have come off along the way, here and here and there and here and over here and here and there. Collectively, those nerves that come off along the path of the plexus before we've gotten to the end of the plexus, collectively those nerves are called the collateral nerves. And what's useful for us to know about the collateral nerves is simply why they're there. Why do branches come off before we have finished forming the plexus? And the answer to that is really based simply on the spatial relationships of the plexus to the elements of the upper limb. Because these five terminal nerves are not formed until we're leaving the axilla and entering the arm, that means that those muscles that are more proximal, in other words, the muscles around the shoulder and the muscles around the walls of the axilla, need to be innervated before those terminal nerves have been formed. And so we take branches off along the way to innervate these very proximal muscles. So if we look at this chart that lists the collateral nerves, all of those collateral nerves that are innervating muscles, the one thing we see that they all have in common is that the muscles that they're innervating are the very proximal muscles of the upper limb, muscles around the shoulder or muscles that are forming the walls of the axilla. And that's about all we really need to say about those collateral nerves. So now let's turn our attention to the five terminal nerves. So we said there are five of them. We said that three of them are anterior division nerves: musculocutaneous, median, and ulnar. Now, we know that there are three segments to the upper limb: an arm, a forearm, and a hand. And each of those segments has an anterior compartment containing muscles. So we have three anterior division nerves, and we have three anterior compartments of muscles. And so this should make it fairly easy to assign nerves to the appropriate muscles, and it's almost as straightforward as that.